Please take your seats. Welcome back. We are now coming to the last, I think, 3 sessions before we finish. And it's my great pleasure to say we have a very stellar program, beginning, of course, with our guest, Tony Abbott, the former Prime Minister of Australia. And I'm going to ask our Master of Ceremonies to take over the chair and launch the proceedings.
Thank you very much, John. Hello, everyone, and welcome back. If you haven't taken your seats, please do so already. My name is Wael Taji representing the Danube Institute. I'm very happy to announce that we are about to have our main talk, our main event today, with the Honourable, I'm not sure if it's the Right Honourable, that's a UK convention, but the very Honourable Tony Abbott, who is the former Prime Minister of Australia, where he led, which he led for 2 years with the Liberal Party. During the time he was in office, and I think afterwards as well, the Honourable Mr. Abbott cultivated a reputation as a bit of a man of the people. He had some interesting interactions with the media on several occasions, which I very much hope will continue into the future. And he's here to talk to us about geopolitics, diplomacy, alliances, and military power. Ladies and gentlemen, would you please give a warm hand to Tony Abbott.
Well, it's wonderful to be back here at the Danube Institute for the 3rd occasion. It's a brief visit, but I hope it's just a prelude to the 4th, 5th, 6th and 7th visits, John. Ladies and gentlemen, in my retirement from day-to-day politics, I enjoy a spacious office on the 65th floor of a classic Sydney skyscraper with panoramic views over the world's finest and most beautiful harbour. But sometimes my enjoyment of this vista is darkened by the thought of such peace and plenty being turned into something resembling Mariupol. Now, if that's an improbable spectre, it's only because Australia and its allies have been prepared, when needed, to stand up for the values we cherish. In the Great War, from a population of scarcely 5 million, over 400,000 Australians volunteered to fight for king and country. 330,000 served overseas, 155,000 were wounded, and 60,000 never came home. An unspeakable sacrifice that still casts a long shadow 100 years later. But militarism was defeated. And then in the Second World War, Australia sent one army to the Middle East and another to Malaya. We sent our Navy to the Mediterranean and our Air Force to Britain. From a then population of 7 million, almost 1 million Australians wore uniform. 40,000 perished, but freedom survived and ultimately flourished, not just in our country, but increasingly around the globe. But unlike the Korea, Vietnam, Iraq and Afghanistan conflicts, all of which Australia contributed to, it was the whole nation that fought those wars as well as the professional soldiery. But what sacrifices would the Australian nation be prepared to make now? Because I suspect that we will have to make some, more than we've recently had to, sacrifices in treasure at least, if we are to avoid having to make them in blood. Because dictatorships are on the march, not just here in Europe and in the Middle East, but in East Asia too. And the only way to see off aggressive bullies is to meet them with an equal measure of strength and determination. Ignoring these challenges won't make them vanish, even though it's human nature to want to. The Ukrainians' courage and flair in meeting an existential threat should reassure us that we also can meet perils, as yet less deadly, in ways that might prevent an even greater catastrophe. There's a famous Yes Minister skit that provides a good illustration of the ostrich tendency to stick our heads in the sand in the hope that problems might disappear. In stage one, said Sir Humphrey, we say nothing is going to happen. Stage two, we say something may be about to happen, but we should do nothing about it. Stage three, we say maybe we should do something about it, but there's nothing we can do. Stage four, we say maybe there was something, but it's too late now. Yet even the most testing of possibilities usually turn out better if they're faced up to steadily. Putin's war was supposed to mean Ukraine's inevitable defeat and dismemberment, given the disparity in size. And it was supposed to mean NATO's inevitable disarray, given Europe's energy dependence on Russia. But something remarkable happened early in January. Instead of keeping under wraps the Russian troop build-up on Ukraine's borders, Western intelligence agencies all but announced that Russian forces were ready to assault, so much so that at one stage President Zelensky accused them of fomenting panic. But the result was that people were more ready when the assault came. President Zelensky scorned the offer of a chopper ride to safety. The Ukrainian armed forces, much better prepared this time than in 2014, harried the invaders into a humiliating withdrawal from Kiev, and the Ukrainian people showed beyond any shadow of previous doubt their almost complete unanimity in not wanting to be part of Russia. Steeled by public anger at blatant aggression, compounded by fury at obvious war crimes against civilians, most NATO countries made large arms shipments to Ukraine, imposed crippling sanctions on Russia, and started to reverse years of running down their armed forces in the expectation that major war had been consigned to the dustbin of history. And even distant Australia has sent nearly 100 armoured troop carriers and is helping to train Ukrainian soldiers in Britain. 9 months on, there have been tens of thousands of military casualties. Many Ukrainian cities are reduced to rubble, and Europe is facing the prospect of a deadly winter. But NATO is expanding, American leadership has revived, Ukraine is winning on the battlefield, and at least one of the world's most brutal dictators now looks a lot less intimidating. Because the Russians are not yet fully expelled from Ukrainian soil, Zelensky can't yet be hailed as the Churchill of the 21st century, but it does now seem that even the worst outcome would be a military stalemate, with Ukraine still viable because Russia has been unable to capture all its main ports. And because the main NATO allies have threatened incalculable consequences should Russia use nuclear weapons, it does seem that Putin has lost his one trump card that might have won the war in a day. Looking back, how could Ukraine's joining NATO ever have been seen as such a provocation when Putin's attack came anyway, while the further so-called provocation of arming Ukraine hasn't produced an escalation against NATO itself? The better lesson of all this is that perceptions of weakness are more likely to provoke war than perceptions of strength, and the more allies a country has, the less likely it is to be attacked. Certainly Finland and Sweden, who used to think that joining NATO would make them less secure, have now decided that NATO is an alliance for peace, not a provocation to war. But if the Russian dictator's repeated claim that the collapse of the Soviet Union had been the greatest catastrophe of the 20th century, and his obvious scheming to reverse it had been more heated, perhaps Europe would never have allowed itself to become so vulnerable to energy blackmail. And if more thought had been given to how Putin could target civilian infrastructure, maybe Ukraine might have equipped itself with more capacity to deter through retaliation. But because Ukraine did seem like a soft target, and because Europe did expose itself, tens of thousands are dead, trillions of dollars in damage has been done, and much of the world will be poorer than it should be because of the disruption to global energy and food supplies. So shouldn't the world have been better, but for our chronic tendency to sleepwalk through Lotus Land, avoiding hard questions and tough decisions. Now, to come back to Australia and a different part of the world, except for World War II, Australia's immediate strategic environment has been dominated by our great allies, first Britain and then the United States. But now, Southeast Asia is contested space between our greatest ally and our biggest trading partner. When he was Prime Minister, John Howard used to say that Australia did not have to choose between its history and its geography. My way of getting around this tension as PM was to say that making new friends didn't mean losing old ones. But at some point, we may have to choose, because Beijing will make us if the commissars decide that a liberal, pluralist democracy of nearly 25 million people cannot be allowed to endure just 100 miles off the Chinese mainland. Now, even though in any conflict over Taiwan, it would less be siding with America over China than with democracy over dictatorship, for us, this would still be a devastating and a wrenching choice. Not only because 30% of our exports would halt, at least temporarily, but because bases such as the US installation at Pine Gap could become Chinese targets if the United States joined the fight. So other than Taiwan itself, the United States and perhaps Japan, no country on earth has a greater interest than Australia in preventing war across the Taiwan Straits. That's why there was such palpable relief when Beijing recently took us out of a long diplomatic deep freeze with a 6-year gap between leaders' meetings that started when we banned Huawei from the 5G network, deepened when Chinese infrastructure investments were blocked, and reached its nadir after Australia called for a full independent investigation into the Wuhan virus. But despite President Xi's emollient recent words, thus far at least there's been no lift in the trade boycotts and no sign that the hostage Australian journalist Cheng Lei might be released. The risk is that we will think Beijing has changed just because the language is softer and official outlets no longer refer to us as the chewing gum stuck on China's boots. But it hasn't. Marxism-Leninism is still reinforcing Middle Kingdom exceptionalism. Beijing still aims to be the world's dominant power by mid-century. And the People's Liberation Army, Air Force and Navy is still daily probing Taiwan's defences, looking for signs of weakness. And even though Beijing's military planners may have revised their timetables in the light of Ukraine stopping the Russian steamroller, they still want to be in a position to destroy US power in the Western Pacific and to seize their so-called rebel province as soon as possible if they can't already. And bad though Putin's war on Ukraine has been, Xi Jinping's long-threatened war on Taiwan would be worse, far worse, and not just for its regional neighbours, but for the whole world. Ukraine is a fight for freedom, but because Taiwan is so much more enmeshed in the global economy, producing 75% of the world's microchips for starters, it would be an existential fight. Putin's war is about our values. Any Xi Jinping instigated war over Taiwan would be much more about our interests too. and not just those of the United States and its allies in the Western Pacific, but those of the 100+ countries that have China as their biggest trading partner. Because whatever stance they took on the rights and wrongs of conflict, and whether or not they imposed sanctions on the aggressor, there would be no shipping, no flights, and virtually no trade, because even the imminent threat of war, let alone actual fighting, would stop it dead. You see, the Ukraine war should have made it obvious that in an interconnected world, no one can be blasé about other people's fights. Even though the ramifications of Putin's aggression and Ukraine's resistance run from energy poverty in Europe to potential famine in Africa, the disruption attendant on any attack across the Taiwan Straits would be several orders of magnitude greater, as the world's busiest sea lanes empty and almost every global supply chain breaks because transport has become impossible. This might make war unthinkable, but it certainly doesn't make it impossible, especially to a regime that doesn't need to win elections and that figures its people are more capable of absorbing pain than the citizens of effete and decadent democracies in decline. So let's be clear about the choices here. Helping Taiwan risks a wider war as China blockades air and sea routes of resupply. Not helping Taiwan guarantees the collapse of the US alliance system as America abandons a friend in need. And that spells the end of the post-war liberal order that's produced more freedom, more safety, and more prosperity than mankind has known ever before, as countries rush to rearm or to make the best accommodation they can with the new totalitarian hegemon. That's why it's so important to learn the right lesson from the current war in order best to avert what could readily become the next one. The worst assumption, though understandable, would be that one massive challenge in Europe rules out another one in Asia. I say it would be the worst assumption because a risk-taking regime might reckon that this is precisely the time to strike. And any pause to reflect in Beijing that Putin's misjudged war might have created is only useful if Taiwan and its friends use it just as judiciously to prepare for the worst as well as simply to hope for the best. For Taiwan, this should mean hardening its infrastructure, shielding its military assets, learning how to swarm an invasion fleet, and to change Beijing's calculus, trying to acquire the capacity to strike back hard. And also to manage this escalating preparedness without driving its own citizens to conclude that freedom is not worth the fight. For the other Western Pacific democracies, it should mean more rapid acquisition of defensive and offensive missile systems, more developed defensive and offensive cyber capability, plus rapid planning for the economic resilience needed to cope, not just with the cessation of trade, but with the impact on production of the loss of Chinese intermediate goods from every critical supply chain. Now again, some would argue that this interdependency of China and the world makes conflict impossible. But I doubt that's the view from Beijing, where trade and investment have always been seen as strategy by other means. Now there's no doubt that Australian attitudes to Beijing have rapidly hardened since 2014, when President Xi's declaration to our Parliament that China would be, quote, fully democratic by mid-century, perhaps marked the high tide of the global wishful thinking about China, that some economic freedom would inevitably bring political freedom in its wake. Far more Australians now see China as a threat than an opportunity. And from diversifying trade to reducing universities' dependence on Chinese students, to making more of an effort to reassure people of Chinese background that they belong in Team Australia, to acquiring a nuclear-powered submarine deterrent, and to lifting military spending towards 3% of GDP, there's a broad bipartisan consensus. Yet none of this is happening quickly enough. So for the best part of 40 years, the world avoided the twin evils of nuclear war on the one hand and the dominance of totalitarian communism on the other, essentially because America was prepared to pay any price, bear any burden, meet any hardship, support any friend, and oppose any foe to assure the survival and the success of liberty, to use JFK's words. And the old Soviet Union understood that there were some red lines that simply weren't worth crossing. This new Cold War will be different from the old one. For one thing, as a first-rate economy, now with the military power to match, China is probably a more formidable competitor than the old Soviet Union ever was. But it will take much the same alliance system, with much the same clear red lines, to gain much the same outcome. An uneasy peace until the inherent contradictions of communism eventually produce some sort of regime change. If Ukraine, with 40 million people, needs NATO's support to resist a nuclear-armed Russia with 140 million, how much more do Taiwan's 25 million need outside help to maintain their freedom from 1.4 billion Chinese? Because what hope can there be in a world where the strong do what they will and the weak suffer what they must? As Burke once observed, when bad men combine, the good must associate, else they will fall, one by one, an unpitied sacrifice in a contemptible struggle. By unambiguously stating on 4 separate occasions that America would definitely fight for Taiwan, even if officials then did walk back what he meant, President Biden might have managed to maintain the policy of strategic ambiguity while at the same time muscling up its content. An important factor in persuading Beijing that it could confront a powerful alliance rather than a rebel province has been the late former Japanese Prime Minister Abe's statement that, quote, a Taiwan emergency is a Japanese emergency and therefore an emergency for the Japan-US alliance. Another is the emergence of the Quad, a strong partnership based on a shared commitment to pluralist democracy. But it's one thing to be ready to fight, it's another to be able to win, or at least to be confident that no rational adversary would dare to risk a war. All history teaches what the Ukraine experience confirms, that weakness invites aggression. We do then have to ensure that our passion for peace never becomes peace at any price, which is neither prudent nor moral, but a weak surrender to evil.